We have this morning a very interesting panel that's going to be looking at something that isn't necessarily on the front page of the newspaper every day. We've been hearing a lot about China. We've been, of course, focused on the trade disputes and looking at a more assertive foreign policy from China, but every day and throughout the world there is a competition in the emerging markets in places like Latin America and Africa for the future of the global economy. And we wanted to take advantage of the expertise here from Robert Amsterdam, Chris Flynn, and Stuart Leach, joined by our moderator, Mark Davis, to take a deeper dive. They've been looking at this issue very, very closely from different perspectives. I'm very excited we have not only an American perspective, but an Australian perspective as well, since they are, of course, have been working with China for many, many years. We are going to look at some of the legal challenges, looking at sectors like the energy sector, some of the developments that have been going on, as well as the communications and public affairs environment that we have to operate in. And we're very delighted to have Robert and his colleagues, and they have been, I think, right to bring this issue forward at this time so we can get a little bit more of an understanding of what's happening around the world. And I'd like to welcome ambassadors, board members, guests as well. Just a word, you're in the Meridian House, which was built 100 years ago by John Russell Pope, who also built the Jefferson Memorial, the National Gallery of Art, the National Archives. So we're very fortunate to have this setting. And I'd like to turn it over to, the biographies are available to you, but just a word, Mark Davis, in addition to being a lawyer, is also a noted journalist, and he's won Australia's highest journalism award 5 times, and will be leading us in the discussion this morning. So welcome, and thank you all for being here.
It's very difficult for a private company to go to secure an asset when on the table your competitor is putting up, well, essentially a Belt and Road project to top up the competition. But that's our job, that's what we've been doing, it's what we are continually doing. We advise our clients how to overcome that, and we do it with some success. Of particular relevance, I think, is Australia's experience, and so that's why we started engaging with Gilbert and Tobin. Australia has in fact been dealing with the sheer weight of China for a good decade now, and some lessons have been learnt, which we'd like to share. We've also joined with Stuart Leach from Pagefield Global Counsel. Pagefield is a political and communications consultancy. Stuart brings another angle in on this issue, which we've always found incredibly useful. So in that competition, when we're facing sometimes overwhelming opposition or overwhelming weight of what China can bring to the table, Stuart brings an interesting perspective in that we can bring reputation, and so that's what Stuart is going to discuss today. Do we value enough our reputations, the reputations of our companies, and what almost dollar value can be put on that? So the format today will be, I'll speak to each of our guests for their key analysis of the type of advice they're giving to their clients. We'll have a group discussion, but very much we do wish to involve the floor. We know there's a great deal of experience and knowledge in this room, and we'd like to engage with it. So there will be a generous amount of time for questions, so please do engage. But firstly, Chris, Australia has faced these issues that are now hot topics around the West. We've faced it for some time. What has been the experience of the weight of China, the economic weight of China in our region?
Well, it's increasingly, I beg your pardon, beg your pardon, increasingly being brought to bear on Australia, so I'm sure people in this room understand. And I think the relevance for people in this room of why is that relevant to the United States? Well, there are two reasons, I think primarily. One is because Australia is one of your most loyal allies, part of the Five Eyes arrangement, and obviously an important part of the United States' ability to project power into the Pacific. And China is also seeking to establish, if you like, a type of Chinese Monroe Doctrine in that area. And we're feeling the weight, the sheer size and weight of that great and ancient civilization re-establishing itself. So that's number one, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But two, as a Western country, Australia is the most integrated Western country into the Asian network. We are, without a doubt, far more integrated and far more aware of what's going on, I think, at the everyday level, everyday Australians, with our businesses, in particular increasingly into our government departments. So they're maybe the two angles from where we come. But just very quickly, if you look at the paperwork we've given you, I won't speak to slides, but there's some interesting slides in there which show graphically what I'm talking about. There is no major economy. There is no major economy in the Western Pacific now that does more trade with the United States than it does with China. There is no economy, no major economy, including your three great West Pacific allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, that does more trade with you than with China. That's quite remarkable, and that's happened in 10 years. If you looked at that 10 years ago, that would have been inverted. That's quite a remarkable thing. The other point to make is, we often talk about the multilateral trading system and the Bretton Woods framework, and as an Australian, we've benefited from that greatly and worked with you, and if you like, we have a degree of not only military interoperability with the United States that we enjoy, but a degree of legal and commercial interoperability, actually. That is very, very useful. That multilateral framework, we all know, is under increasing stress. But importantly, as China becomes the largest source of capital in the region, it's already the largest trading partner. It's the largest source of savings. It will become the largest source of capital. Institutional licks of capital will come out of Shanghai, not New York. As that happens, the multilateral framework comes under more stress, but also change comes from the bottom up. What we're beginning to see increasingly is that these large licks of capital are being required to be written under Chinese law. That's remarkable. As an Australian, when I see a New York law document or an English law document, I'm completely comfortable with it. I understand it. I know that there is no political conditionality associated with it. But here we have a strategically oriented investor in the region that is centrally organised and projecting through investment objectives that are consistent with broader power projection objectives of China. And the way Australia is having to accommodate and deal with that is quite nuanced. We've released a new foreign policy white paper that addresses these issues. And in many ways, the reason we're here is coming out of a discussion I had with Rob Amsterdam in March, which followed a paper that I gave to our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade at their legal retreat in March on these issues. So there's a great deal of change coming. We're maybe 5 or 10 years ahead.
Ask you though, specifically, what are we talking about here? Give me an idea of that ring of islands around Australia, a very resource-rich ring of islands. I know all of your major clients are there, and you are there often. What's actually happening there for your clients in bidding for resources?
So you'll find a good example is Papua New Guinea, which is obviously formerly part of Australia, or at least a trust territory of Australia, and now an independent country, and strategically very, very important to Australia. It's resource rich, it's obviously a big gas exporter now, and is important in terms of the greater energy security dynamic in Asia. It exports gas in meaningful quantities to Japan, Korea, and to China. Now, in that way, I'll just put it to you this way. It is in Australia's national security interests that Papua New Guinea remains in our orbit. From a client perspective, it's also in Australia's national security interests and Papua New Guinea's that it bees and remains a part of the broader energy security framework in Asia. In that context, what we're seeing is an increasingly, I don't want to say aggressive, but very, very assertive investment approach by Chinese companies into Papua New Guinea. They are able to bid for on a strategic basis, rather than simply using the market-based approach that Australian and American companies would take, assets in a very, very competitive manner, or to propose projects to these countries that are very, very attractive to them. I'll give you an example. On Manus Island, which is an island north of Papua New Guinea, it is one of the approaches to Australia that the Japanese took that we, along with the Americans, repelled in 1942 and 43. Manus Island...
It's near Guadalcanal, which Americans might relate to.
Exactly. And recently, there is no industry on Manus Island. The Chinese offered to build a container port, a very large container port that was quite hardened in terms of the concrete it used, and the way Australia's had to respond is to overbid for the container port, which is a dual-purpose container port, obviously. That's infrastructure that is not required right now in Manus Island. Or, for example, bidding for pipelines on the gas projects. So Exxon has a very large LNG facility on Papua New Guinea. It perhaps is the world's best LNG facility. It's very, very efficient. China is bidding very, very hard to the government on the pipelines for that project. And obviously that's a choke point. If you look again, just very briefly, and I'll stop. If you look again, you'll see that I've mapped out the major sea lines of communication in the world, and you'll see in there a bunch of blue markers. Those blue markers are investments by Chinese state companies into ports. You'll see that those markers sit on choke points. It's very, very important. They are dual purpose. And while they have a lot of them have a legitimate commercial purpose, they're obviously dual purpose. So it's an important transition that we're dealing with.
Okay, we'll come back to that, the Australian experience, because I am interested in how Australia is dealing with it, because
Sure.
I think it will. There's lessons to be learnt in that time. Bob, you're well known in Africa. You have very extensive history there. These issues that we're talking about now, the trade conflicts, the trade tensions with China, in some ways it's old news in Africa. What have you seen? What transition have you seen in Africa over the last 20 years, and what are you advising your clients who want to do business there?
Well, we've seen a complete, really an incredible change. African countries who need to develop because of the youth revolution in Africa, the percentage of Africans that are under 35, and they've found that with the increasing Western conditionality on loans, that they can't get infrastructure built in the times required for democratic elections. So the Chinese have come across with packages, a mixed package of the building of public infrastructure facilities, roads, combined with the investment of state-owned enterprises and some private enterprises, combined with the importation of Chinese workers, and they have transformed the face of many countries in Africa. And I want to be very fair to the Chinese, because a lot of their aid to some of the poorest African nations has been forgiven. And in this world where we're all into this hyper competition, we need to understand that the Chinese people only feel they rose up at the time of the revolution, after 100 years of humiliation, where to balance our trade, we imposed opium on their people and used those taxes to basically build our empire. So the Chinese, understanding that, have forgiven a lot of debt in Africa, and that often gets overlooked. Unfortunately, because so much of their aid is unconditional, it has also led to tremendous problems in terms of the allocation of resources, the use by many of the incumbents of Chinese aid for political purposes and campaign purposes. And something that I've dealt with, because our firm does a lot of expropriation work, is that you hear the term in Africa, resource nationalism. Well, you know, we did the Yukos case in Russia, and one of the things I can tell you about resource nationalism is that means somebody is funding the PR around nationalism to steal an asset. And that is what's happening in Africa. We are on the ground in Congo facing expropriation of Western American investors who are dealing in, let's face it, a horrific environment. But the nationalism of Kabila has nothing to do with nationalism. What he's engaged in is asset theft, and the backup are the Chinese state-owned enterprises who do back-to-backs with these African leaders. And that's affecting rule of law everywhere. You know, we're on the ground fighting cases in, for instance, Zambia. Sit down with Zambian lawyers and talk about the change to rule of law in Zambia that's been fostered by the tremendous amount of Chinese activity. This is a serious problem. It's not going away. And, you know, I welcome the new BUILD Act in the United States, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. The other thing I'll tell you is Myanmar. Myanmar was coddling and coming close to the West and shutting down Chinese investment a few years ago. Now, I am the first one to complain about what's happened with the Rohingya, and I certainly deplore it. But we need to understand the tremendous economic cost to us when instead of sanctioning individuals, we sanction governments. Because what's happened in Burma is they've just signed about $3 billion of new deals with China because the United States basically closed the spigot. And Burma is going to become China's California, and in a very big way. And one of the things we as a country need to understand is that the weaponization of our legal system, the weaponization of our currency is going to be short-lived. This is not a long-term prescription for anything. And this is having a dramatic effect in Africa, where our kleptocracy initiative basically means that rulers will not give up power. Why is Paul Biya going for another term? Why am I dealing with Museveni in Uganda? Because they know that they face unlimited prosecution if they step down. We need to set up an exit for those leaders, or we're going to be putting Africa in this continuous cycle.
But Bob, you know, all business aspires to a level playing field. That's how markets work if they're to work well. Is it a level playing field, though, in Africa?
It's you know, firstly, it's not a level playing field. But secondly, we in the United States have tremendous tools that we don't use to try to level the field.
But the Chinese government has tremendous tools, and they do use them. This is the problem, isn't it? You've got Chinese companies with enormous backing.
They have the ability to do a concerted campaign, an integration of state, private, almost civil society, a whole package to the African governments. But you know, one of the things I will say about what the U.S. has been doing with China in respect to this trade war, which I hope we can get into, is that there is actually a systemic focus by the Trump administration on a lot of these issues. This is not a tariff war that the U.S. is engaged in. The U.S. is engaged in my view, whatever one may think of the president, this is a very serious attempt to address currency manipulation, to address the non-market nature of the Chinese economy. This is very thoroughgoing, and as a Canadian American, a dual national, I can tell you that the Canadians are still smarting from these negotiations. And there was no need to humiliate the Canadians like there's no need to humiliate the Chinese. But let me tell you, the new NAFTA is an improvement for American business. The new NAFTA also hampers Canada in that it allows for the termination, if possible, if Canada enters into a free trade agreement with China. So there is a real change in terms of American trade policy, and there is also a tremendous move by both Trump and Xi Jinping towards bilateralism. One of the amusing things we can get into is there are many comparisons between Trump and Xi Jinping. And the move to wanting to deal bilaterally, wanting to get out of alliances and going one-on-one is one of the things they have in common.
I would like to just bring Stuart in, and then we'll come back to a general discussion. If that's, we'll sort of lay out what each firm does. Stuart, in this very active competition between Western companies and Chinese companies, I know you are, as we all are, involved, particularly in Africa. In your business, you're the guy to call when something goes wrong. You're used to that happening and using reputation as a shield against PR disasters, if you like. But I know that you also firmly believe in using reputation as an asset to win business. Could you give us an idea of?
Well, it's a good question that you ask, Mark, but because it is not so much a shield and a sword; it's a two-edged sword, I think. And people tend to focus very much on the risks and how will you handle them when they arise. But what makes handling the risks easier, in my experience, is if you've started from the right place and you've used the other side of the sword and built the reputation in a way that's effective, not just to protect you from the risks that are going to arise, but actually effective within the business scenario that you're operating. So we've heard mention of the great weight of power of the Chinese, and if you're going into bat against someone who's got a lot of power, then you need to have something that they might want and that can be very powerful. And it strikes me that reputation really fits that very well. Because if you are embarking upon an expansive foreign business policy, you want to be able to deal with people, and you want people to want to deal with you. And you will be judged by the company you keep. So if you are in the position of having to tender against maybe local Chinese businesses where you know price is going to be an issue, how do you counter that? And I believe reputation can be a very strong card in that situation. And I think that businesses who've spent time getting their reputation in order before they embark upon these ventures will do better. Now, I'm not talking about a great, glorious PR campaign or an advertising campaign. I'm talking about understanding what reputation really is. And someone once said to me, and I quite like it, is that reputation is what people say when you're not in the room. And I think bearing that in mind, it's important that when you're going into these sorts of territories and in these sorts of businesses, that you think about who's in that room and what you want them to think, and put in place the strategies to communicate it. Now, obviously, you've got to think about what you're going to communicate. And in this situation, I think putting across your blue chip record, putting across the things that you do from a compliance point of view, putting across how you treat workers, putting across how you're going to get involved in a local level within that business, putting across all the things that you have by virtue of coming from an economy that's developed, that understands rule of law, that understands fairness, that understands about the true, the appropriate dealing with disputes. Those things are very powerful tools, I believe, when you come to tendering or to negotiation or to managing a business relationship. And I think if you get those things right and you play them out through government relations, through local advocates, through all the things we know about in communications, then when the difficulties arise, and let's not shy away from it, there are going to be many difficulties in these territories with these partners, but you're in a much stronger position to manage those risks. And I think you won't look like somebody who is a lapdog to somebody else's drive for world domination, but you will look like somebody who recognizes the changing world order and is trying to be collaborative in making that work for everybody. So I think that the reputation side is a very strong card to play. I'm not sure it's being used, and of course we're always very ready to help.
I know this is
Had to say it.
I know this is a popular discussion point for you, Bob. We've spoken about it before. Do you think Western businesses, Western miners in particular, actually put their best foot forward? I mean, Western miners are off, is almost a dirty term in the Western media, if you like, but is that appropriate, and should we be putting out a better message?
Well, look, I think the extractive industries as a whole have not addressed that issue properly, and there's been a tremendous amount of catch-up. But, you know, when we are dealing with our clients in these countries, we give them very simple advice. Advice number one, which will sound ridiculous to you, but I'll tell you what I tell them anyway, is if you're dealing in any of the countries in Latin America or Africa that has a young youth population, build a soccer league and put your corporate name on those T-shirts. I call this the Roman Abramovich way to protect your assets. And it worked
For a while.
It worked for Roman for a while, I was going to say. And as long as your government then doesn't poison a few people in Salisbury, you may be okay. So you have to invest in the soft targets that matter to the people you're working with. You may not be able to bribe because of the FCPA, and I will talk separately about how wrong I think this emphasis on corruption has been and how detrimental it's been to American interests. But you may not be able to engage politically the way you want to, but you can engage socially. You can actually, you know what? You can build hospitals. You can bring in doctors. You can make yourself an important stakeholder in society. And it's incredible to me how many of my clients resist this. And for the price of a good lawyer, not a cheap lawyer like myself, but a good lawyer, you could build the wing of a few hospitals. And that kind of thing, it involves soft power, and that's where the Chinese and the Indian companies have been quite successful. But I think the other side of the reputation issue that we all need to understand, we were just involved in the Bobi Wine case in Uganda, where an opposition leader was tortured to the brink of death by a government completely dependent on US military assistance. And we embarrassed the hell out of the Ugandan government, I'm proud to say. And our firm did this pro bono, and there was very little to attack us on but one thing. Amsterdam is a tool of Western donors. Trust me, the West in Africa does not enjoy a great reputation based on the colonial history and based on our present anxiety, what I call the securitization lens. If you want to talk American foreign policy in Africa, you have to talk about AFRICOM. And you have to talk about how we're bombing the hell out of northern Africa and how we have made incredible numbers of enemies in countries that were our friends. We cannot see the world through the lens of 9/11 forever. There are more to these countries than whether or not somebody will constitute a security risk to the United States. And lesson number one is middle income people don't bomb buildings. If you can help bring the circumstances of people so that they're not starving and they're not completely embittered, you actually have a shot of really controlling the security risks to the United States. But when you leave people worrying about drones, and it's interesting, another counterpoint is Pakistan, interestingly enough, because one of the things about Belt and Road that's fascinating today is that countries are turning off some of the Belt and Road initiatives because of what happened in Sri Lanka, because the Chinese took over a port for 99 years. So
Isn't part of what China's doing, though, they're filling a space that we once inhabited, and we should, much of the world congratulates them. They are, in fact, doing the very thing you're saying, which is investing in communities with useful infrastructure. Perhaps to each of you, why aren't we applauding them rather than fretting about them? We used to do that.
Well, I think that's a good point. So the point that has to be made, and it's a point certainly that we're taking, is that this is not something. We're not in a place where we need to pull up the ramp and batten down the hatches. That's for sure. The reality is, as I said earlier, a great and ancient civilization is re-emerging and reasserting itself, and we cannot expect that China will behave or in its own interests, naturally in the same way that the United Kingdom and the United States behaved in their own interests when they emerged. And so that's quite a natural thing. So certainly as an Australian, we have nothing but to engage. We have nothing to do but to engage, and to engage robustly. The difficulty here though, is that this is not the United States or the United Kingdom. This is not a Western power. This is a different civilization. And it's a great civilization. This is not a change in the software of international trade. This is a change in the operating system, in a way. So we need to be familiar with it and work with it and engage with it. And so, you know, just to go back to your point on the level playing field, and we'll get to the infrastructure point in a moment, we're not dealing with a country that's looking at this from a Westphalian nominal sovereign equality perspective. This is a tributary state, and countries sit in a hierarchy that is determined by their proximity to cultural, actual, political, to China. And you know, that's a big shift, and that's where the bilateral investment treaty framework comes in. We're moving potentially from a framework vis China that looks more like a spider's web to one that looks more like a wheel, hub and spoke type of arrangement. These are big issues, and it's quite different from the framework that this place, the United States, that this city put in place after World War II. In terms of what you've,
exactly.
in
The
terms of
Chinese
what,
investment program is the Marshall program, right?
Quite, but it's within the framework that I just described. So to go to your point, and how do our clients respond? So I think there are two things here. The first thing is we do have to engage and we have to compete. We've got a strategic investor on one side. On the other side, Western companies whose strategic investment is viewed through the lens of trying to achieve a particular shareholder return for their shareholders. Allocative efficiency and market efficiency. I'm certainly not going to speak against that. But what we do need to do is have a much closer coordination between our businesses and our government, because we need to have some way of emulating that central planning, that analysis and that information sharing that can occur within a more centrally planned, outwardly focused investment framework.
Which the Chinese are doing brilliantly. They're brilliant,
yeah.
right?
You
There's
don't
complete
get
coordination.
to send a big lick of money out of China without an approval, right?
Yeah. Is that insurmountable? I mean, can we over...
Well, I think the important point is not should we be congratulating them. We should be learning. And if we're in a battle which we can't win financially or in terms of land, then we need to win hearts and minds. And standing back and not doing that through the right channels and building your reputation and putting into place the sorts of things Bob was talking about, I think the danger of losing hearts and minds is that you become really, really prejudiced when you get into tough negotiations. And that's the point behind it. I don't think, you know, people do what they have to do in order to succeed. And I think that's what we should be doing and learning.
And there's another huge issue here that I don't think the United States has grasped. The relationship between China and Russia is a strong relationship, growing stronger. The Vostok movements that occurred are a huge signal to us about a coordinated methodology. And let me say something, because we spent a lot of time in Europe. The Chinese have what's called the 16+1 program. The Russians have what's called the bribery and stooping program, both of which are equally successful at disaggregating the European Union. And really, if you want to know the truth, the British should be holding they should be finding their own Bob Mueller to talk about the Russian support of Brexit, because that's very real. And the disaggregation of Europe that's happening before our eyes is a result not only of Russian activity, but of a coordinated level of activity. And people, I always refer people to something called document number 9 that was leaked by the Chinese, not by them, leaked from them in 2013. Document number 9, in my view, began with Vladimir Putin. It was not an internal Chinese development. And it came as a result of the color revolutions and the fear that Putin transmitted very effectively to the Chinese when their internal coordination really began. So this isn't just a matter of, how do we change this operating system for businesses, this is a tremendous threat, a real national security threat. And one of the things I'll say about the Trump administration is they believe in the same tributary system as the Chinese. And that's not a joke. That's reality. The Trump administration is disentangling us from these ugly alliances, according to them. And they are putting us in a situation where we are going to be more and more dealing bilaterally, not with friends, because we're not going to have any friends anytime soon, but with countries that we are now viewing solely along one ambit, which is, you know, what have you done for me lately? Have you come up to your 2%? Have you done this? Have you done that? And this instrumentalization is very important because in the fight for values, we're actually giving up the fight. So when you talk about where's our soft power, it's going, and it's going in a very big way. And let me assure everyone here that, and we're honored to have the ambassador of Turkey here today, what happened in the embassy in Istanbul would never have happened under any other American administration. Never. The outrage that that constitutes to the most basic mores of international law, international diplomatic law, these are rules that would never have been breached. And the fact that they were breached in a NATO ally and no comment was made by this government for days, and now it appears this government is engaged in a PR exercise in washing the reputation of an absolute criminal in this. This is shocking stuff. And people in Africa who are fighting for democracy in their countries, the Bobby Wines of Africa, are going to look on this with fear because they recognize that the United States is literally giving up its historic role in terms of some basic values here. So when we talk about how do we fight the Chinese, it's a hell of a lot harder to fight if we've given up soft power.
Well, in a business sense, as lawyers, we're all lawyers, or ex-lawyer down the end as well.
Still one.
Still one, okay. You know, we often fixate on the deal, and often multilateral deals. We base all of our decisions on certain international conventions that we can rely upon for our investors. Is that under threat too? And if so, how is that changing?
Briefly, I don't know if it's under threat. I think that ultimately the way in which we do business needs to change a little bit. Obviously, you know, I come from a country that has benefited enormously from the multilateral trading framework as a middle power, geographically isolated. We've just come out of 27 years, still in it, 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth, ironically off the back of China, but benefiting greatly from the security that we receive from here and also the multilateral framework that has been put in place from here. And so, but that's about to change for the reasons I'm about to say. It means that business needs to change. We need to engage differently. We're working carefully to see how we do that. And I think in that way, Australia is probably, as the country most engaged in Asia, the Western country most engaged in Asia, probably 5 to 10 years ahead of our other allies, actually, in this place. If you like, the canary in the coal mine, someone has said maybe we'd call it the budgie in the coal mine, and we don't own the coal mine anymore. But the reality is, you know, we're engaging, and I think that there are two things in terms of doing a deal. As a lawyer, when you're advising your client, the primary litmus test by which a deal should stand is that it should never, and true of treaties as well, when you're helping a country with a treaty, it should never be easier or cheaper for the counterparty to breach their obligation to you than it should be for them to comply. That is the ultimate rule, because in a common law country, the doctrine of efficient breach means that the courts will let you go, actually, right? You pay your damages, you can go. So the idea is to get a long-term deal. The idea is to make sure it's never cheaper to breach than comply. That requires a bit of technical skill. It's harder to do that, where the price points and the valuation model that the competitor is using or the counterparty is using is strategic rather than market-oriented. That's a harder thing to do. You need to take into account a broader set of considerations. That requires a closer established relationship between business and government, a much closer degree of trust than we currently have in our countries. We achieve our efficiencies through having government and business quite separate. And I'm not saying that should change, but what we do need to have is a closer established relationship between them at a very, very, very intimate level. And that in order to be able to compete in this way. That's the first thing.
I wonder whether it shouldn't change, though, and I might ask the other two on this as well. I mean, if our competitors have the complete backing of the diplomatic, the sometimes military and financial support of their government, that's almost unbeatable. Are we doing enough, as our government's doing enough to support our businesses? I mean, the world has changed on this.
Well, I mean, it goes back to what I said a bit ago. If you're competing, you've got to compete effectively and use everything you've got. And if that, part of your whole communications is not just outward, it's internal as well. And you should be working to garner as much support from the people who can help you in order to make sure it's an even playing field. You should be doing that as much as you can, which is also another important part of reputation, because if you have a good reputation, people are much more inclined to assist you and get involved. So yes, obviously you've got to do that.
But there's something else we should be doing, and I see this across Africa. The key African states, minus Nigeria, just signed a massive trade deal, if you will, a free trade agreement for Africa. We should be down and dirty with that initiative. We should be supporting the building of that infrastructure of trade within Africa. We should be doing the same thing. I mean, right now, some of the key countries in Central and Latin America are in terrible shape. We should be doing a lot more to assist the governments there. We're active all over this region, and we really mourn the lack of American leadership in Central America, the overemphasis on legal initiatives, the lack of emphasis on employment initiatives. We need, I think you both my colleagues are 100% correct. We need to learn from the Chinese. We need to have a far more directed, coordinated campaign to connect our industries with defense, which of course is the one aspect of our economy that's booming big time, and put together some real alliances. There, in Canada, under the Chrétien administration, they approached taking Canadian companies abroad with what they called a Team Canada approach. And it was a coordinated investment approach between government and industry that was extraordinarily effective. As of today, Canada is the biggest player in the extractive industry in Latin America in terms of number of mines, not in gross numbers. And a lot of that flows from what Chrétien did. There are real ways we can deal with this, but it requires a rethink. Along the lines, by the way, as I said, people are underestimating the Trump administration when it comes to trade. There's a lot of very serious thinking going on in the administration. NAFTA was a success, those negotiations. They are moving towards this dispute with China in a systematic way. They are not just looking at tariffs. And I think one of the things the United States is also not assessing, and I think it's very serious, is we never understand command governments. The Chinese government is as dysfunctional as our government or as the Russian government, or even more. But we never see that. We call it China as if it's a monolith, and it's not. And Xi Jinping, if the growth rate in China breaks 6% on the downward spiral, he could be out. And we could be engineering that. And do we know what the ramifications are if he's gone? Because we need to understand that the anti-corruption campaign, and this is what I always say to people who back the FCPA so much, that, this is really good, we're changing things. Well, not really, because anti-corruption campaigns were really begun in a way by Yuri Andropov, the ex-head of the KGB. And he began the anti-corruption campaigns because he knew that if you call someone corrupt, it's a hell of a lot easier to liquidate them. The next big backer of anti-corruption was Daniel Arap Moi in Kenya, who was the most corrupt leader Africa's ever seen outside of Mobutu. So we need to understand that this fixation on anti-corruption has to be measured and has to be part of a much broader picture. And by the way, the monies you recover have to be invested back in Africa, not in the US Treasury. So there's a lot of state responses we can engage in and we can refine. And this war with China, and I call it a war because it's not a trade war, this war with China and their activity in the South China Sea, all of this is extraordinarily dangerous and Hobbesian in terms of where the world is going. We are not interacting with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are not interacting with the new Eurasian body that Putin is trying to build. By the way, at Valdai, the day before yesterday, Vladimir Putin said, "We have witnessed the end of US hegemony. It's over." And he's trying to obviously build himself up, because I will tell you, it is not a sign of strength for a Russian leader to raise the pension age. This is a terrible sign of weakness. And I'll tell you something else. If you want to know whether Xi Jinping feels he will do a deal with the United States, there is one thing to look at. I was in China during the dispute with the Japanese, and there were massive anti-Japanese demonstrations. Notice with all the tariff trade issues that Trump has done, there has not been one anti-American demonstration sponsored by the government. When those start to happen, when boycotts start to occur, then you know the Chinese have given up. So far, they haven't. So far, there's still room for negotiation. And I think what the Chinese are starting to now realize is the negotiations aren't going to be over tariffs. They're going to be over intellectual property. They're going to be over all of the rule of law issues and trading imbalance issues. And again, whatever you want to say about Mr. Trump, he has been a consistent advocate of this for decades. And Leitziger and Navarro, again, whether you agree with them or not, they are really focusing on the inner workings of these trade agreements. This new NAFTA is a big deal. Study it, look at it, because it's the blueprint for what the United States wants to do with China.
I might just take this chance now to throw to the floor. You now know the basic positions of each of our panellists. More than happy to involve you now. If there's no takers, we'll go back to the panel discussion. But if you'd like to speak, and it would be useful if you introduce yourself, just at least what industry you're from. It'll help tailor the answer.
Good morning. My name is Nia Kwete. I think the best thing to say is that I'm Bob Amsterdam's friend. I am African, and I live in Washington, and I'm an analyst of foreign policy. I've done this for like 40 years. I'm very focused on China in Africa, and I want to say that the discussion is wonderful, but we also need to take into account the feelings of the countries where China is making inroads, and in my case, the feelings of Africans. To just keep the comment short, I would like to say, living here as an immigrant from Africa and watching the United States and other Western countries, I will tell you that as you learn from the Chinese and as you adjust, you must adjust, but please don't give up your advantages. Don't give up democracy. Don't give up the rule of law. Don't give up civil society, because African leaders are signing big loans. But please look at the reaction of Africans on the continent. And I am for the United States re-engaging seriously. Africa's history with the West has not been too wonderful. However, if we are going to look at the Chinese approach to development as we see it today versus the Western approach, where people like me who are critics of African governments will not be disappeared, then we prefer the Americans, but you have to come in properly and you have to stop calling us shitholes.
I'll take that It's a comment, not a question. In the back row, please.
Hi, my name's Philip.
And if we could, generally, we'll try and keep the questions as brief as possible and the answers. No great long answers.
Okay, my name's Philip Fanikak. I'm also a very good friend of Bob Amsterdam and also come from the African continent. I just want to make one point where I would disagree with Bob, and that is the effective anti-corruption legislation, starting with the FCPA, which has now spread to all the OECD countries. Britain, Norway, France have all adopted anti-corruption legislation, and now we have a Treasury implementing Magnitsky sanctions, for instance, against people like Dan Goethe in the Congo. This is a huge restraint on how Western companies behave in countries in Africa. And I think it's a very important part of how we kind of basically do our reputation. And it's, that's where the disadvantage comes in, and that China hasn't any similar kind of legislation.
Doesn't have the restraint, is what you're saying.
And the issue is, how do we're going to start negotiating on intellectual property rights, on tariffs or whatever. I don't entirely agree on the position of the Trump administration's taking. One of the things we really have to do is to get those competitor countries to some other tie into some international convention which would prevent them too from doing the kind of things, the corruption, which has completely destroyed development in Africa, and which countries like Nigeria and even my own country, South Africa, are kind of like struggling out of. And in that sense, the West has an advantage, because the West now does say our companies, the people that go in, are bound by some kind of codes and some kind of convention that prevent them from destroying it.
But this is the trouble, is that the international conventions are in fact collapsing. There is one, the whole mood towards international conventions.
Let me just say one thing, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I agree in terms of the fight against corruption, and certainly applaud it. No argument. What frustrates me is you can't have that as your sole tool, because that's a negative, that's the stick without the carrot. You have got to also, and I think this is very important, we have to bring down compliance costs for our small businesses. The FCPA has really ruined the ability of small and medium-sized business to enter emerging markets, because the compliance costs of having a competitor report you are so grotesque that you're really frozen out of the market. So while the fight against corruption is critically important, and by the way, I think there should be a lot more civil ability to go after corruption, I think we have to balance it with an ability that the government can sponsor so that small and medium businesses can work in Africa. Because right now, I can tell you firsthand, we do a lot of work both on the British and the American side on this, that those compliance costs are not even 6, they're 7 figures a year. Because you're not only looking at how your own people are behaving, but you've got to go into your relationships with agents and third parties. So it's awfully expensive.
We are approaching time. I'd like to get a few more questions if I can. Yes, sir, Dan.
Ariel Cohen, I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the founder of International Market Analysis. It's our firm. We're doing a lot of work in Eurasia, in the former Soviet Union. And between the Black Sea and the Chinese border, the Chinese are eating our lunch in terms of investment, in terms of disregarding FCPA. Bob is absolutely correct. When I travel around the world, the major complaint is not just FCPA, it's the extraterritorial punitive reach of the American law without the investment. So kudos to the Trump administration for reconstituting OPEC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation. But what does the panel think about Eurasia, the 3 countries of Southern Caucasus, 5 countries of Central Asia, in terms of what can we do to balance China and Russia, because most of these countries are in the Russian-sponsored Eurasian Economic Union, but the volumes of investment from China are much higher than volumes of investment from Russia. And when I talk to the leaders of these countries, they tell me that they want American investment, they want American connection, and since Bush Jr. through Obama to Trump, we are not there. We are ceding the territory to China and Russia?
There's one very simple answer, which is to re-engage with Turkey, our major ally in the region that we have absolutely treated horrifically for the last number of years, and in a partnership with Turkey, re-engage in Central Asia. And I think one of the things that's incredibly important to realize is that China and Russia are engaged in an existential competition in Central Asia. And while it's coordinated now, the possibility that it will later not be coordinated is incredibly significant. And we should at least be a player in the region. And right now, we're barely a player.
The other part of that obviously is the subcontinent India, and obviously there are moves afoot, coordinated moves to try and bring India forward with quadrilateral and that sort of thing, and not just maritime focus, but also focus into that region. But I think it is very important.
Yes, sir.
I think you might do it without the aid. Oh no, here comes the mic.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I've been working in Africa for about 30 years. I've never been Mr. Amsterdam, but I want to meet him. You're great. You're fantastic. And I want to tell you that on the trade field, we work on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and absolutely right on. It has more economic advantages for countries like the US, where you can produce in one plant, one country, ship throughout it. Fantastic. Also, a very quick comment on foreign corrupt practices, and then my question. Africa has a different view of corruption. And for them, the most corrupt people operating now are US multinational corporations. And as Mr. Mbeki pointed out, through under-invoicing or over-invoicing as a way to get money out of countries, out of the US has something they call the Trade Facilitation Agreement as part of WTO, that they want to reduce the amount of checking that Africa does on prices in the name of smooth trade. There's an issue out there, and I do hope we could have a debate about not the concept of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but how it operates, and I think the point. My question is aimed specifically at the Congo, because Mr. Amsterdam, you made that comment about some case in the Congo, and I'm interested in it. This is where we are on the front line in the current fight for democracy. Thanks to the Trump administration and others, Haley up in the UN, we are having an election in the Congo in 2 months. We have perhaps a unified opposition for the first time. Not one word in the press, nobody even discusses it. And this is an issue which is worthy of every NGO's involvement. They like the Congo, they complain about individual practices. So my real question is, one, tell me about the Congo, but two, what can we do to assure that we have, quote, a free and fair election in the Congo? We got them in Nigeria, can we now get them in the other great country in Africa, the Congo? Thank you.
Briefly, if you can, Bob, because we're going to get another...
Very, very briefly, you're 100% right. The Congo is critically important for 100 reasons. Selfishly, it is the storehouse of all of the minerals we need for the post-fossil fuel energy revolution. And we cannot be out of there. It's number one. Number two, what we can do to assist is work with the French. This isn't just our job. The French have a tremendous amount of influence and moral suasion there. Number three, we have to go after more than Dan Gertler. There's a system in Congo under Kabila. We need to expose it. We need to give Africa more attention overall. Africa is our future. It is the future of mankind. It is the future of mankind because if we don't get Africa right, the civil wars that will break out in Europe over immigration are absolutely existential. We have to get Africa right for our sake, for Europe's sake, and for Africa's sake. And the youth revolution in Africa is not understood in the West. I've just been exposed to it through our fortuitous representation of Bobi Wine. And in Uganda, 80% of the populace is under 35. If you can't constructively engage with that populace in Africa, God knows where we all end up.
And your point about getting it talked about is a very well made one. I mean, certainly our difficulty of getting Africa correspondents in the London media to write about these issues is so difficult. I mean, getting anybody to write about anything other than Brexit is really difficult. But when we worked with Bob on the Bobby Wine thing, once you got the spotlight of media onto it, it has results. And we need it from the top, actually, because then maybe they'll start writing.
Before, we've still got 5, haven't we? You just gave me, okay.
There's a lady over there.
I might just ask ask a question of Blackiston, actually. So Michael Blackiston's a resources partner at Gilbert and Tobin. He's known as Mr. Africa in Australia. So before we start to sound too bleak about the weight that we're having to carry in Africa, you're doing gangbusters, right? And so you are representing Australian companies in Africa against the Chinese and still coming out with deals. You know, your entire wisdom in 30 seconds, please. How is that happening?
Look,
Stand up, perhaps, Michael.
Get that.
Yep.
Thank you. Look, the issues that we face is that if it's a sovereign-to-sovereign relationship, it's very hard to compete, because at that level, with the sovereign-to-sovereign relationship goes an unattached, unaccountable payment that's made for the local government to do with that payment what it wishes. So we don't tackle that one. What we try and do is tackle those projects where there are reasons for us to be there. And one of the reasons that's now emerging with China, because of the sort of investments that they've been making in the past, is the ability for governments to give sovereign guarantees has now contracted, because those sovereign guarantees were often related to projects that weren't profitable. So China is feeling the pressure of that. So they are trying to get money out. They need to get projects that actually have some sort of return. On the African side, they can't give sovereign guarantees because you've got the people like the World Bank that are actually putting some pressure on these governments. So for our position, as long as we're away from a sovereign to sovereign, we as Australians can compete and compete very well. One of the reasons why we do that is we were a country that was colonised. You know, we weren't a colonial power other than for PNG. So we actually can relate to the African experience. Because you go to Africa, and I do both Francophone and Anglophone, you're a Brit or you're French, the history of 50 plus years ago is still very real in those civilisations. So we go along as people that have a history of having got there on a convict boat in our country, and so we can relate. The other thing that we need to do, and is a big advantage for us, is we take as a nation, we take people on face value. So when you go into a country, and particularly across all of the African nations that I visit, I learn about their culture. I learn about the tribal system. I try and have a relationship with people. I visit. Cameroon, I've been there over 40 times. Malawi, over 35. Because I built those relationships that when you actually then have the conversation, they know you're there as a friend because you've built that relationship. And okay, we have money, everyone can bring money, but like the Chinese, their business relationships are not so much contract, they're built on the face-to-face. Mm-hmm. And we've found that in the clients that I represent, that face-to-face engagement is key.
Thanks, Michael. We have one more question. I know there was a lady, I think it was down in the middle here, and that it will be our final question, I regret.
Hi, Lily Kniff. I'm a recent graduate from George Washington, and I've worked primarily within trade associations. My question is referencing the systematic approach towards China that has been mentioned numerous times today. Recently, in the past year, we witnessed Section 232 used as leverage in the NAFTA renegotiation. And my question is, are we seeing something similar in the proposed withdrawal from the Universal Postal Union? And if so, what messages does this send? What signals does this send in terms of establishing a systematic approach for dealing with China?
Either.
Go ahead.
Sure, that's a very, very good question, and I think one of the points to make on 232 is that there would be American companies obviously that would say that that was a long time coming. That was a long time coming, and there was a real competitive advantage that was established for countries, not just China, but countries like China, by the Postal Union Agreement. But I'm not sure whether I would say it reflects on one hand something that's systematic, but I think the challenge that it presents is probably this. I agree with Bob. He said earlier that it's not just China is moving towards bilateralism, and for the reasons I set out before in terms of tributary approaches and whatnot, China favours bilateral arrangements, and that's very, very clear. But has benefited from the multilateral framework. The United States has also moved towards bilateralism under this administration. But I think if you take the broader context, and maybe I would say this self-servingly as an Australian, any sort of, if you like, institutionalised or systematic move away from the multilateral framework would be a long-term competitive disadvantage for us. Because ultimately, even if we were to more centralise some of our decision-making around both investments coming into our countries and making investments out and competing with more centrally planned economies, the strength in our approach is the market framework and the efficiencies that we receive from the market framework and the freedom, actually, that comes with it, and the innovation that comes with it. And all of those things within the way that we approach the global market actually occur best under multilateral frameworks. I definitely believe that. Again, it's somewhat self-serving as an Australian to say it, because we get to play on that field with you. But you need us, and you need Canada, and you need the United Kingdom, and you need your allies. You really do. In this one, you do.
And there's one point I would make, and we're seeing it right now in Canada. The Trump approach, which is not just to hard negotiate, but to humiliate, which is not going to work with China, has backfired with Canada. So what is Canada doing right now? They're opening free trade talks with China because Trudeau feels he has to, because he was so humiliated by Trump's treatment. And this is very significant to the Five Eyes relationship, they're bringing in Huawei to do 5G in Canada, which is, as we say in Turkish, meshuga, because that's going to involve tremendous complications. But in the absence of multilateralism, you have these going across the sovereignty issues, you have tremendous complications and problems. And this is the downside of the Trump approach.
I regret to say we have to end it there, deeply regret it. I think we're allowed to linger perhaps for a little while in the foyer. Can I extend my thanks to Ambassador Halliday and to the Centre itself. It's been a real privilege to be here. And could you please thank each of our guests, Chris Flynn, Amsterdam, and Gilbert, and thank you for coming.